Executives are, very often, genuinely the last people in the entire building to hear that their own company is quietly in real trouble. And not because nobody actually knew, because everyone below them knew, and every single one of them quietly decided it wasn't their job to be the one who said it out loud. There's a name for this pattern in organizational psychology. It's called the mum effect, short for mum's the word, a term researchers gave it decades ago after running controlled studies specifically on how willing people are to pass along negative versus positive information to someone else. The pattern held up consistently across those studies. People reliably hesitate more, delay longer, and soften more when the news is bad, purely because of who's receiving it, not because of anything about the news itself changing. This isn't about dishonesty. Almost nobody involved is lying outright. It's about a much quieter, much more insidious dynamic. Messengers of bad news get punished, subtly and often unintentionally, and everyone in an organization learns that lesson fast, whether or not any manager ever consciously decided to punish anyone. Here's how it actually plays out in practice, step by step, because the mechanism is almost invisible if you're not specifically looking for it. A frontline manager reports a missed target honestly, with real context about what went wrong. Their own manager reacts with visible frustration, maybe just a sharper tone, maybe a harder set of follow-up questions than usual. Nothing dramatic, no punishment, on paper. But the frontline manager notices the reaction and files it away. The next time something goes wrong, that same manager softens the report slightly. A missed deadline becomes a minor delay. A serious risk becomes something we're monitoring. Nothing false exactly, just softened, rounded off at the edges, framed in the most forgivable light available. Now repeat that softening at every single layer of a 5 or 6 level hierarchy. Each person passes the news upward through the exact same filter that was just applied to them. By the time a piece of genuinely serious news reaches the top of the company, it has been softened 5 or 6 separate times, by 5 or 6 different people, none of whom individually lied, and all of whom collectively turned a 5-alarm fire into a mild inconvenience by the time it reached the one person with the authority to actually do something about it. This is precisely why senior leadership is so often blindsided by problems that, in hindsight, everyone below them clearly saw coming months in advance. It's not usually a failure of information existing somewhere in the company. The information existed, in full, at every single point along that chain. It just never survived the trip upward intact, arriving at the top a fraction of its original size and urgency, filtered down through layer after layer of individually reasonable, individually forgivable softening. You can watch this exact mechanism play out constantly in ordinary corporate reporting structures. Project status reports marked green, week after week, right up until the week a deadline is suddenly, unexpectedly missed, even though the team building the thing privately knew for a month that the timeline was already dead. Board updates that read confidently optimistic straight through the quarter, right up until a surprise announcement lands that retroactively makes every prior update look either dishonest or wildly out of touch. Neither explanation is usually accurate. What actually happened is a chain of individually reasonable people, each one slightly softening what they passed along, compounding into a complete information collapse by the time it reached the top. Here's the part that should genuinely change how you run meetings, not just make this feel like an interesting psychology fact. The mum effect isn't primarily caused by bad people withholding information out of malice. It's caused by a reward structure that punishes honesty about problems more reliably and more immediately than it rewards it. Fix the reward structure, and the information starts flowing again on its own, without a single new policy or process needing to be written down. Consider what actually happens, moment to moment, the very first time bad news reaches you as a manager. If your visible, immediate reaction is frustration, however understandable that frustration genuinely is, you have just trained the person in front of you, and everyone who hears about that reaction secondhand, that bringing you bad news carries a real cost. That lesson gets learned instantly and remembered for a very long time, often far longer than any explicit policy about open communication that you might separately post on a wall or repeat in an all-hands meeting. The fix here is genuinely not about lowering your standards, and it's not about pretending bad news doesn't bother you when it clearly does. It's separating your reaction to the problem itself from your reaction to the person who told you about it. Those are two completely different things, and most managers, under real stress, unconsciously merge them into one single reaction aimed at whoever happens to be standing in front of them at the time. A concrete practice that works remarkably well here: the moment someone brings you a piece of bad news that's genuinely useful specifically because it arrived early, while there was still time to act on it, say so out loud, specifically, in the moment, in front of them. Not a vague, "thanks for letting me know." Something specific. "I'm glad you told me this now instead of next month. This is exactly the kind of thing I need to hear early." That single sentence, repeated consistently over time, does more to keep information flowing upward than any anonymous suggestion box or open-door policy ever will, because it directly rewards the specific behavior you actually want more of. This matters even more in industries where the cost of delayed bad news is measured in real safety terms, not just missed targets. Aviation has spent decades building formal structures specifically designed to counteract the mum effect in the cockpit. After investigators traced multiple accidents back to a junior crew member noticing a problem but hesitating to challenge a senior captain's decision directly. Modern crew resource management training exists precisely because relying on individual courage to override the mum effect in the moment under real-time pressure was shown to consistently fail. A well-known engineering case follows the exact same shape at a much larger organizational scale. Engineers working on a major aerospace program raised specific technical concerns the night before a scheduled launch. Concerns that later analysis confirmed were well-founded, but those concerns were softened and reframed as manageable risk by the time they moved up through several layers of management approval. The individual engineers weren't ignored maliciously by any single villain in the story. Their genuine concerns simply lost specificity and urgency at every layer it passed through on its way up. The exact same mechanism as a missed deadline getting softened into a minor delay, just operating at a scale with far higher stakes attached. If a highly technical, safety-critical organization with enormous institutional expertise still fell into this exact trap, an ordinary company shouldn't assume its own reporting culture is somehow naturally immune either. There's a second lever worth adding here, beyond just reacting well to bad news once it arrives: actively going and looking for it, rather than waiting for it to survive the trip upward on its own. Managers who make a habit of talking directly to people 2 or 3 levels below them, not to go around their own direct reports, but simply to hear an unfiltered version occasionally, catch problems noticeably earlier than managers who only ever hear information after it has been summarized upward through every intermediate layer. This isn't about undermining the chain of command. It's about accepting that the chain of command is also, structurally, a filtering mechanism, and every filter loses some signal no matter how well-intentioned the people inside it are. What that conversation actually sounds like matters more than most managers assume. Walking up to someone several levels down and asking, "Is everything going okay?" reliably gets you the same softened, filtered answer you'd have gotten through the normal chain, because you've just asked the exact kind of vague, closed question that's easiest to answer with a reassuring yes. A far more useful version is specific and low stakes. What's the one thing on this project that would surprise me if I found out about it in 3 months? That question doesn't ask someone to accuse anyone or blow a whistle. It gives them permission to name a real risk under the cover of a hypothetical, which is often exactly the amount of psychological distance someone needs to say the true thing out loud for the first time. Consider how differently a single project update reads, depending on which question generated it. Asked, "How's it going?" A team lead says, "On track. A few minor things to sort out." Asked, "What would surprise me in 3 months?" The same team lead, in the same conversation, on the same project, says honestly, "The vendor integration is behind, and if it slips another 2 weeks, we'll miss the launch window entirely." Nothing about the actual state of the project changed between those two answers. Only the shape of the question changed. And that shape alone was enough to get past several layers of instinctive softening that a vaguer question would have sailed straight through. Here's the part that most managers miss entirely, and it's worth sitting with for a second. The mum effect gets systematically worse the more senior and more successful you become, not better. A brand new manager still remembers what it felt like to be junior, still remembers the discomfort of delivering bad news upward, and often overcorrects toward welcoming it. A senior executive, years removed from that position, surrounded by people who have learned exactly how to soften things for them, can go an entire quarter genuinely believing everything is under control, purely because nobody around them believes delivering the unfiltered version is worth the personal cost of doing so. There's also a subtler version of this worth naming directly, because it doesn't look like classic bad news at all. Disagreement itself often gets filtered the exact same way. An employee who thinks a strategic decision is a mistake will frequently just quietly comply, rather than voice that disagreement upward, for the exact same reason a missed deadline gets softened. The mum effect isn't only about crises and failures. It's about any information the messenger suspects the listener doesn't want to hear, which covers a much wider range of everyday workplace communication than most managers assume when they first hear this described. Healthcare has run its own version of this experiment, and the results are directly useful for any manager thinking about how to actually fix the problem rather than just describe it. Hospitals that shifted their error reporting systems from punitive, blame-first responses toward a genuinely non-punitive, learn-first response saw a real, measurable increase in the number of near-miss errors and small mistakes actually getting reported. This sounds backwards at first. Reporting went up, not down. But that's precisely the point. The errors themselves weren't happening more often after the policy change. They were simply becoming visible for the first time, because staff no longer believed reporting a mistake would cost them something personally and immediately. A rise in reported problems, in that specific context, was a sign the system was finally working, not a sign things were getting worse, and any manager evaluating whether their own open communication policy is succeeding should look for exactly that same signal. More small issues surfacing sooner, rather than assuming a clean-looking report, always means a clean-running operation. The academic research on this general area also points to a related concept worth knowing by name: psychological safety, the shared belief within a team that it's safe to take an interpersonal risk, including the risk of delivering unwelcome news or voicing disagreement, without facing punishment or humiliation for it. Teams that researchers rate as high in psychological safety don't necessarily have fewer problems. They surface problems earlier and discuss them more openly, which is a very different and much more valuable thing than a team that simply reports fewer problems on paper. Here's the piece I think gets missed most often in how this gets discussed. Everyone agrees, in the abstract, that they want to hear bad news early. Almost no manager would say otherwise if asked directly. The gap isn't in belief. It's entirely in behavior, in the split second right after the news actually lands, before anyone has time to consciously choose how to react. That split-second reaction is almost never planned or deliberate. It's instinctive, driven by genuine surprise or disappointment. And it's precisely because it's instinctive that it gets read by everyone watching as the real, honest signal of how you actually feel about bad news, far more honest than any policy statement you might make afterward once you've had time to compose yourself. This is why simply announcing an open-door policy in an all-hands meeting so rarely changes anything on its own. The policy lives in the deliberate, composed part of your communication. The mum effect lives in the instinctive part, and the instinctive part is what everyone is actually watching and calibrating against. This also explains why the effect tends to compound quietly over someone's career rather than announcing itself all at once. A new employee arrives with no established read on how their manager reacts to bad news, and forms that read within their first few genuine tests of it, usually within the first several months on the job. Once that read is formed, it rarely gets revisited unless something dramatic happens to force a re-evaluation, which means an early, one-time, instinctive overreaction to bad news can quietly shape how honestly that specific employee communicates with you for years afterward, long after you yourself may have forgotten the incident that originally caused it. So here's the concrete, practical takeaway, the kind you can actually apply in your very next one-on-one. Stop demanding more honesty from your team in the abstract, as a value stated once in an all-hands meeting, or quietly written into a culture document nobody actually revisits after the first week. Instead, change what visibly happens in the specific moment bad news actually reaches you. Notice your own instinctive reaction the moment bad news lands, before you've had any time to compose yourself into a more measured response. Separate your feelings about the underlying problem itself from your reaction toward the specific person standing in front of you delivering it. And the very next time someone brings you a piece of genuinely useful bad news, early enough that there's still real time left to act on it, say so specifically, out loud, right in that moment, so that person, and everyone who eventually hears about that exchange secondhand, learns exactly what kind of behavior you actually want more of going forward. Follow along for more of these theories, the practical kind that actually change what happens the next time bad news lands on your desk, not just the trivia version of the story.